1943. Wren. The ward smelled of boiled bandage and metal. A field lantern sat under a gauze cone, throwing a thin circle of yellow on dented stretchers and the rough stitched sleeve of a gray uniform. Rain tapped the roof like nervous fingers. Footsteps muffled in the corridor. Someone cursed under a breath. Pierre's gloves felt damp, the seam of his thumb catching on old linen as he pressed a cold ampule into the light to read the label. On the far bed, a small body curled beneath a folded blanket, shoulders trembling. A bloody armband drooped from a nail on the headboard, a map of decisions in stain. He's the enemy. He's a patient. One ampule. Pierre's thumb trembled as he pinched the glass, and the lantern's flame guttered. And he had to choose. Mercy where hate was expected. In an occupied ward, a single ampule sat between a groaning German sub-officer and a feverish 9-year-old hiding beneath a blanket. The surgeon's oath stood in the doorway like a rule written on the lantern's light. Treat the patient first, even if the patient is the enemy. That promise was not abstract that night. It was the only disguise that could keep the boy alive. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. Renee watched, fingers white on the tray. The sub-officer's breath rattled. The boy's fever made him small under the blanket. Pierre inhaled, closed his eyes, steadied his hand, and reached for the glass vial. The ward had become a requisitioned aid station inside the municipal hospital of Rennes. French sheets lay over German stretchers, and soldiers checked papers like a second pulse. Pierre and Renee worked under the command of a makeshift surgical unit, treating wounds from patrols and the occasional shelling beyond town. Supplies were thin, a handful of morphine ampoules, frayed bandage rolls, 2 stretchers for a dozen beds. Nights brought inspections and the risk of being searched for contraband or fugitives. Triage, the practice of sorting patients by who needs care first, happened with quiet fingers and quick looks. The Geneva Convention, spoken of like a distant rule, still mattered here. Wounded people were supposed to be protected and treated, no matter the uniform. Pierre remembered the medical oath in simple words: heal the patient before politics. That oath would collide with orders and suspicion in the days ahead. Oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. Renee moved between beds like a metronome, tucking a blanket here, whispering a name there. Paperwork piled on a metal cart, lists of arrivals, rubber-stamped and watched by patrols, and Pierre, when he could, altered a line with a steady hand. The lantern's cone hid hurried sutures and the quiet barter of bread for a clean rag. Each small falsified entry might buy the ward another dawn. Pierre had wrapped the boy's small body in a loaf bag and a spare blanket, the smell of warm bread trying to cover the faint copper of fever. Renee had come in through the back with her arm full of rations. She set the carrier by the foot of a stretcher and pretended it was a loaf of bread. The boy's knees knocked like 2 small hammers. She smoothed his hair, cut a slit in an old sleeve so the boy could hide his wrist beneath a bandage and let him breathe against the metal frame. "Where did he come from?" a matron whispered. "From a train," Renee answered, quieter than the rain. "Keep him quiet," Pierre said, and his hand lingered on the boy's shoulder like a promise. Hiding him was not charity, it was improvisation. The ward was a map of vulnerabilities and quiet lies that kept people alive. The next day, a sub-officer arrived, brought in half-carried from a skirmish near the rail yards. He clutched his abdomen, sweat like a river under his collar. Pierre moved with the efficiency of the practiced surgeon he was, a gloved hand on a pulse, a quick lamp on a wound. The sub-officer's face flinched between pain and suspicion. Papers were stamped at the door. The ward had to look orderly. "His wound?" the guard asked. "Internal bruising, possible perforation," Pierre said, the words clinical and brief. "Any contagion?" the man pressed. "Only trauma. He must rest." On the chart, Pierre wrote a line that shifted a child's fate. Accompanying febrile, kept with convalescent. The entry was a stitch in the ward's fabric, a lie small enough to be plausible, but wide enough to hide a boy. The oath guided the pen as much as the scalpel. A cart rattled in with only 2 ampules left. Renee set them out on a tray like relics. For weeks, morphine had been measured in precious drops and rationed to the worst of the worst. A stretcher groaned with a young man who had been in a trench collapse, his ribs flagged with dull hurt. The sub-officer moaned louder, and all eyes counted need against noise. "1 ampule," someone said, the complaint barely a sound. "We give it to the worst," Pierre replied. "Who decides?" a nurse asked, and the question hung like steam. The decision was never abstract. It was hands and faces and the sound of someone crying out. Pierre looked at the boy, small chest heaving under a blanket, then at the German whose lips turned blue with pain. He thought of rules and treaties and the raw human calculus of need. Later that night, when the town felt a world away and the lantern's cone seemed the only honest light, Pierre and Renee worked beneath gauze and hush. The boy's wound had become more than fever. A pocket of infection needed opening, draining, and stitching. They could not call it an operation. It was a trespass everyone in the ward had already agreed to. "Does it hurt?" Renee asked, her thumb cool where she pressed the boy's wrist. "A bit," he whispered, "like when I fell off a roof." Pierre cut quickly, the metal tray between them clinking with instruments hidden under a towel. He moved with the care of a man who knew every motion would be amplified by suspicion. Renee kept the lantern's glass angled away from the window and muffled the sound of metal on metal. "Steady," she said. "Hold his hand," Pierre added. The work was precise because there was no margin for error. Every stitch had to be tight, every bandage applied so the boy would not wake with a cry that would invite questions. Their hands practiced mercy like a habit. At dawn, a patrol came in for an inspection. The ward formed itself into silence. A sergeant moved down the rows, clipboard in hand, eyes flicking like knives. He asked for names and numbers and marched fingers over notes as if the ink could betray them. Renee answered with the calm of someone who had lied to survive. "Count beds by nationality," the sergeant ordered. "There are only convalescents," Renee said, voice steady. "Everyone on the list now," he replied. One of the orderlies, a man who had once been kind, leaned too close to a bed and noticed a small blanket tucked oddly, the outline of a child's frame beneath the bulge. His face tightened. There were whispers later that afternoon. "You hide Jews here?" And the accusation landed like a stone in a pond. Rumors spread quicker than the fever they feared. "You risk us all," said a nurse who had seen too many patrols. "He's a patient," Pierre said, hands still stained from the night's work. "That may not matter to them," the other answered. She would pay a price for that decision. The ward now carried the heat of suspicion. The sub-officer named Wilhelm began to recover. He turned in his bed one night and found, folded into his palm, a small photograph. A family by a river. He traced the faces with a shaking finger. Across the room, the boy slept, bandaged and pale, a stranger to the Germans' home life, yet a living reality on the same wooden frame. Wilhelm watched, and for a moment, the uniform did not keep him apart from memory. "Danke," he muttered once, when no one had asked him to speak. René only nodded and wrapped his hand in the blanket, as if cupping a small bird. Wilhelm turned his face away when a patrol passed, breathing through his teeth and not reporting the boy. The small kindness changed how people moved in the ward. Soldiers who had been blunt now searched less in the folds of blankets. Nurses began to pass bread a little more discreetly. The ambivalence in one man's pocket, his photograph, became a silent shield. Mercy, it seemed, could be purchased by a single human gesture. Threats did not disappear. The regional commander sent paperwork demanding lists of transfers and statistics by nationality. An officer read the ward's register and frowned at an odd annotation. A name erased, a line rewritten. He tapped the page as a judge might tap a gavel. "Explain this," he said, voice flat. "It was a clerical correction," René answered, palms open. "Who authorized it?" "Dr. Lemaire." Later, in the cramped office, the officer leaned in a way that mocked friendship. "You work for order, doctor," he said, "not for secrets." "I work to save lives," Pierre said, quiet as a bell. "Do you understand what you risk? Your hospital, your licenses, your family?" Pierre's jaw set. His oath felt cold and heavy in his chest, like a stone he must carry alone. René would be watched for the next weeks. The act of saving one boy had redrawn the lines of trust in the ward. Small acts accumulated. A night orderly smuggled antiseptic from a Red Cross crate to clean a dressing when no one was looking. An old priest who brought last rites to a dying man also slipped a note sewn into a cuff that directed the Mercures to safe paths out of town. The ward's ledger grew, with names that were nothing like records. A child's alias here, a false transfer there. When the shelling edged closer one morning and the windows rattled like a frightened throat, the ward took its shape as refuge. Stretchers were readied for a possible evacuation. Pierre organized a silent chain to move the most vulnerable first, placing the boy in the middle, disguised by sheets and the generic gray of convalescence. "Move him as if he's a patient, not a package," Pierre instructed. "Understood," René said, and her face was all business. They rehearsed paths through stairwells and service doors, using the lantern to mark the way and wrapping the ampule supply in gauze to keep it from rattling. The practical work was calm. Danger hovered like smoke. Each motion was governed by the oath and the need to preserve a human life, while avoiding the notice of those who would unmake the ward's safe shape. Every falsified note, every extra stitch, every withheld report was a small transgression against orders, but a defense for a life under their care. Mercy became a set of small, precise rebellions that the staff kept between their gloves and the feel of a pulse. The morning after the morphine arrived, the ward moved like a machine wound tight. Pierre held the ampules in the palm of his hand, as if weighing the weight of a life. He looked from the groaning face of Wilhelm to the slight rise and fall of the boy's chest. René watched him, her mouth a thin line. "We have only two," she said. "Give one to him," Pierre answered, voice low. "He will sleep. The boy's fever will spike. If the sub-officer screams in the night, they'll come. We keep the ward quiet." Pierre bored a tiny drop into a spoon, counting heartbeats as if they were ration stamps. He injected it into Wilhelm's vein. The sub-officer's hands loosened. His breath found a steadier rhythm. René wrapped the spent syringe in gauze and tucked it away. The immediate danger ebbed. He chose the loudest pain first to shield a smaller life beneath the same roof. That afternoon, someone left a satchel at the foot of the boy's bed. A photograph folded in oilcloth, a child's name penciled on the back. An orderly who had once been a baker came by and paused. He looked at the boy, then at the German in the next bed. "What if they search tonight?" the baker whispered. "They seldom check the corner beds," René said, arranging pillows. "They like names and numbers, not faces." A rumor began to crawl through the ward about a planned roster check. Pierre and René rehearsed an account. They moved the boy's blanket to a place where the gray of the uniform piles could hide him. René rewrote a line on the ledger and smudged it with her thumb to look honest. "The roster will say he's a convalescent's nephew," she said. "Say it well," Pierre answered. Records could be changed with the same skill as sutures. The ward learned how to lie with confidence. When a doctor from the occupying command visited to audit the unit, his shoes clicked in the corridor like small drums. He peered into beds, sniffed the air as if it might carry contraband truth. He stopped at Wilhelm's bedside and prodded a wound with the blunt end of a pencil. "How stable?" he asked. "Improving," Pierre replied, calm. "Any special cases?" "Only what we can handle." The inspector tapped a finger over the ledger. He raised an eyebrow at a small, faint annotation that might have been missed by a less careful eye. René smiled and described the boy with a cough and a febrile spell. The officer nodded as if satisfied, then left, with the quiet authority of someone who had not quite believed, but had decided to accept the world as it was presented. The officer's nod was a small mercy that needed no oath. Night came with a sound like a sigh. Pierre prepared for the clandestine work that had become routine. The boy's infected wound needed a proper drainage, not just dressings. There was no anesthetic left to spare except for a few sterile gauzes and the memory of morphine. René sharpened a scalpel on the inside of a tin lid while the lantern threw a soft halo over the table. "He'll bite," she said, folding a strip of rag into the boy's hand to anchor him. "Then steady the jaw," Pierre answered, and his fingers moved with the familiarity of many performed operations. They improvised a local block by firm pressure and whispered encouragements so the boy would not cry out. The incision was quick. The pus was drained into cloth. Pierre's face was close to the wound, eyes narrowed by concentration. He stitched with a thread so fine it could have been invisible. "No sound," René murmured when the last knot was tied. "He's already quiet," Pierre said. They closed the dressing, dampened with a ration of antiseptic smuggled from a Red Cross pack. The lantern hummed, a quiet companion. The boy slept, drenched in relief that was mostly fear turned into drowsy surrender. A surgical act in secrecy bought them more hours of safety. It cost them sleep and a constant awareness that any careless noise could undo their work. Word of the boy's presence bled into the town in muffled ways. A neighbor of an orderly mentioned seeing a small figure leave in the back of a confessional. Someone else swore they'd heard the boys whistling when they moved stretchers in the night. The gossip reached the ears of a nurse on the morning shift who felt the weight of the ward's exhausted lies. "You hide him and risk us all," she spat one dawn, her voice frayed. "He's a child," René answered. "We are protected as medical staff. That is our job." Protected until someone says otherwise, the nurse said, and her hands twisted. The nurse's anger was not only fear, it was also a hunger to follow rules in a time when rules seemed to vanish. For a day, she refused to bring the boy an extra bowl of soup. Renee watched his small shoulders hunch and felt the sting of that omission like a fresh cut. Every kindness extracted a price. Each omission or act of courage left a mark on people who were already thin with worry. A courier arrived with a list of names and a new rule. All non-essential patients to be transferred to a hospital further inland within 48 hours. The command wanted statistics, movement, and compliance. The ledger grew heavy with signatures that could endanger those who had been hidden in plain sight. Pierre met with Renee in the supply room. They ran fingers over stacks of papers, eyes on the stamps. "They will take anyone without strong paperwork," Pierre said. "We must falsify a transfer for him." "It's a risk," Renee replied. "A necessary one." They planned a false transfer to a town chapel, a place where the McClures could move people under the guise of church charity. The boy would be labeled as a mild fever transfer. At risk, an innocuous case. Renee folded the paperwork with a steady hand and added a plausible stamp. She felt her chest tighten, but did not stop. Forgery for protection was a new kind of medicine at that hour. When a new patient came in late, he staggered on a stretcher, coat ripped, with a wound that suggested a struggle. He mumbled in a patois that Pierre did not know. His eyes darted like a hunted animal. "Where did you find him?" Renee asked. "By the river," the stretcher-bearer answered. "We dragged him from brush." The man had a fever and signs of exposure. Pierre examined him and found shallow lacerations that could have been self-inflicted or the result of being hunted. The possibility that he was a fugitive, not merely a stray civilian, hung between the curtains like cigarette smoke. "If he's a partisan, he will be questioned," Pierre said. "If he is taken, they will find the boy," Renee added. They decided to stabilize him enough to appear non-threatening and moved him to a bed at the far end of the ward. The newcomer coughed and then slept, sweat on his brow. Pierre wrapped his wounds and left a note to monitor his vitals. To treat a man without asking his allegiance was a rule the ward kept like a prayer. It also increased the danger they lived with every minute. One evening, a physician from the municipal authority, one who had more loyalty to the town than to the occupiers, pulled Pierre aside. He lowered his voice. "They ask for volunteers to assist a field clinic out west," he said. "Those who refuse will be watched. Those who volunteer will be praised." "I cannot be praised," Pierre answered. "I am tied here. Yet you hide men who put others at risk." "My duty is to heal," Pierre said simply. The municipal physician's eyes softened for a moment. "I will look the other way if you can manage returns on the ledger," he said. "Thank you," Pierre murmured, and in that exchange a small bargain was struck. Not with the occupiers, but between people who understood the thinness of survival. Alliance did not require banners in that ward. It required small confirmations of solidarity. Summer heat gave way to the damp sense of autumn. The boy began to mend under the stitched bandage, his cheeks regaining a hint of color. He learned to move without shouting, to swallow soup without drawing attention. Each night he listened to stories the staff told him under the lantern, tales of the McClures who navigated occupied roads, of priests who hid documents, of neighbors who turned blind eyes when needed. Those stories were a curriculum in secrecy. "Do you miss home?" Renee asked once, as she smoothed his blanket. "Yes," he said, and the name he offered was not the one on any register. "I want my mother's bread." Renee sat for a long moment, thinking of the ration lines. She tore a piece of her own bread and pressed it into his hand. "Then eat it in small bites," she said. He smiled, the first real smile since arrival. Care sometimes felt as simple as sharing a loaf. Sometimes it felt like stealing light from the night. A month passed with a fragile rhythm. Then the rumor of a surprise inspection spread like wind in dry grass. Word was whispered that officers from the regional headquarters would be descending on the hospital at any hour to cross-reference all patients with transport lists. The ward stiffened. Pierre gathered the staff under the flicker of the lantern. He spoke low. "If they check, we present the roster as it is," he said. "No one panics. No one lies beyond what we already have." "What if they ask about the child's birthday?" the matron piped up. "Give them a generic answer. The less they pry, the better." Renee took the boy's hand and braided his hair back from his forehead. The lantern's light trembled as if from a gust at the window. Someone whispered a prayer. The boy's small fingers clung to Renee's apron like roots. They practiced the route the forged transfer would take, should it become necessary. Men moved stretchers silently, tucking blankets to look uniform, rehearsing the way a single lifted curtain might hide a child's shape from a cursory glance. The staff had become choreography designed to avoid notice. Their moves were rehearsed kindnesses. When the inspection finally arrived, it came in the gray of pre-dawn. Boots crossed the hospital threshold with a weight that pressed the air into the rooms. Orders were barked, lists were scrutinized. The touring officer ran his finger down columns of names. "Any unregistered cases?" he demanded. "None that I know," Renee said, voice steady. "Be precise," he snarled. An orderly. The baker, who had paused at the child's bed weeks before, observed the officer's face close enough to see the twitch in his jaw. The man swallowed, and then, in a decision that surprised himself, he simply stepped forward and cleared a stack of bandages from a cart. He spoke loudly about inventory in a tone that made the officer look away. "Here, inventory is important," the baker said, and he counted bandage rolls with theatrical care. "Very well," the officer muttered, and then moved on down the ward. A small distraction bought them minutes. When the officer left, nobody applauded. They merely breathed. Camaraderie had become a quiet shield. It did not erase fear, but it redirected attention. In the weeks that followed, a new strain of weariness settled over Pierre. The man who had once been a civilian surgeon found himself performing clandestine operations with the same hands that had once cut ribbons at town ceremonies. He forged signatures, lied to auditors, and stitched wounds that the law might have condemned him for if it had known the truth. Each act layered another worry on his chest. "Do you regret it?" Renee asked one night when they sat on a creaking cot between shifts. "Regret?" he echoed, looking at his bandaged hands. "I mean, the lies, the risk, your family back home." "My oath," he said, and the words were a single, solid thing. "One life under my care is the same as any other. The rest follows." He slept less, haunted by the possibility that one misstep would unravel all they had sown. The ward's small rebellions had a cost he knew he would pay eventually. A neighbor from the parish brought a note. A patrol had been seen moving through the old market that afternoon, interrogating anyone whose name sounded unfamiliar. Fear tightened like a wire across the town. For the first time since the boy's arrival, Pierre felt the current of danger turn into a wave. "We will enact the transfer tonight," he said. "Are you sure?" Renee asked. "We have no other choice." They wrapped the boy in a gray blanket, smoothed the folds so there would be no telltale bulge. The lantern was trimmed and covered with an extra layer of gauze to soften its glow. Renee tucked the forged transfer forms into the pocket of a cleaner's apron and clasped the ampule case around her wrist to keep it silent. As they moved down the corridor, the ward held its breath. The boy's small body lay between two stretchers, indistinct and heavy with fatigue. An orderly with a rosary in his pocket guided them through the service stairwell. The steps echoed only where Stone had given them permission. At the stairhead, a silhouette blocked the landing, a young guard returning early from patrol. He carried a rifle and a cigarette. For a single frozen second, lantern light and gun metal faced each other like two small moons. The guard's eyes passed over the blanket and hesitated. "Where to?" he asked, more curious than suspicious. "To the chapel," Renee answered with the practiced inflection of someone who had rehearsed the phrase 100 times. "Make it quick," he said, and his cigarette ash fell between the steps. They moved past him, breath held, and the stairwell's door closed behind them with a muted click. Every small victory was a door closing softly in the night. Each one kept the danger outside for a little longer. The lantern lay cold, and the ampule sat empty on the metal tray, its glass a quiet witness. The bloody armband was folded into a drawer, a small proof of choices made under pressure. Paperwork later showed a corrected transfer. Wilhelm kept his creased photograph and never spoke of the boy. Faces in the ward shifted, less suspicion, more guarded kindness. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. If this account moved you, subscribe and explore more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.